Nobody at Riverside High School expected their new PE teacher to change everything. Especially not the group of seniors who thought they owned the gymnasium. But sometimes the quietest people carry the loudest secrets. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn air hung thick with humidity as students filed into the gymnasium at Riverside High School in Georgia. It was the first week of September, and the familiar smell of floor wax and old basketballs filled the cavernous space. Sneakers squeaked against the polished hardwood as teenagers reluctantly gathered for their mandatory physical education class. Mrs. Elena Rodriguez stood quietly near the equipment storage room, clipboard in hand, watching her new students with careful eyes. At 42, she had the soft build of someone who clearly enjoyed her food and didn't spend hours at the gym. Her graying hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore modest athletic wear that did nothing to hide her fuller figure. To the casual observer, she looked like any middle-aged teacher who had settled into a comfortable routine. "Great, another out-of-shape PE teacher," muttered Jake Patterson, the star quarterback whose Letterman jacket seemed permanently attached to his shoulders. His voice carried across the gym, designed to be heard by his usual crew of followers. Brittany Wells, head cheerleader and Jake's girlfriend, giggled as she flipped her blonde hair. "I know, right? Like, how is she supposed to teach us anything about fitness when she obviously doesn't work out herself?" The group of popular seniors had claimed their usual spot near the bleachers, far enough from the teacher to feel safe in their commentary, but close enough to establish their dominance over the younger students. Marcus Thompson, the basketball team center, crossed his muscled arms and shook his head in mock disappointment. "My mom could probably outrun her," he said, earning another round of snickers from his friends. "This is going to be the easiest class ever." Mrs. Rodriguez appeared not to notice the whispered comments, though her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She'd heard it all before at her previous schools. The assumptions, the jokes, the immediate dismissal of her authority based solely on her appearance. She'd learned to let it roll off her back, focusing instead on the students who actually wanted to learn and improve. "All right, everyone, please gather around," she called out, her voice carrying a surprising authority despite her gentle demeanor. "Welcome to physical education. I'm Mrs. Rodriguez, and I'll be your instructor for this semester." The popular group exchanged glances and moved with exaggerated slowness, making it clear they weren't impressed. Jake whispered something to Marcus. That made both boys laugh, while Brittany rolled her eyes dramatically. "Before we begin any activities, I want to establish some ground rules," Mrs. Rodriguez continued, seemingly oblivious to the disrespect. "This class is about more than just physical fitness. It's about discipline, respect, and pushing yourselves beyond what you think you're capable of." "Yeah, right," Jake muttered under his breath, just loud enough for his friends to hear. "What? Would she know about pushing limits?" Mrs. Rodriguez's eyes flickered toward the group for just a moment, but she pressed on. "Today, we'll start with some basic assessments. I want to see where each of you stands in terms of endurance, strength, and agility. This isn't a test you can fail. It's simply a baseline so I can design appropriate challenges for each of you." She walked over to a cart filled with various pieces of equipment, stopwatches, measuring tapes, cones, and clipboards. Her movements were deliberate and economical, lacking the bouncing energy typically associated with PE teachers, but there was something precise about the way she handled each item. "We'll begin with a mile run around the track," she announced. "I want you to pace yourselves and give me your best effort. Remember, this is about establishing where you are now, not competing with each other." The students began making their way toward the exit that led to the outdoor track. The Georgia heat was already building, despite the early morning hour, and several students were already complaining about the temperature. "This is ridiculous," Brittany whined, adjusting her perfectly styled ponytail. It's too hot to run. Can't we just do something inside? Yeah, Mrs. Rodriguez, Jake added with fake concern. Are you going to run with us? You know, lead by example and all that. Mrs. Rodriguez paused at the doorway, turning back to face the class. For a moment, something flickered in her eyes. Not anger, but something deeper and more complex. I'll be timing you from various points around the track, she said simply. My job today is to observe and assess. The group of seniors exchanged knowing looks. Marcus shook his head with a smirk. Figures. She probably can't even make it around the track once. As the students filed out onto the track, Mrs. Rodriguez remained behind for a moment, alone in the gymnasium. She walked slowly to her office, a small room adjacent to the main gym that previous teachers had used for storage. The walls were bare, except for a single framed photograph that she'd placed on the desk, a picture of a much younger version of herself, lean and powerful, crossing the finish line with her arms raised in victory. She touched the frame gently, her fingers tracing the image of the medal hanging around her younger self's neck. The gold caught the light in the photograph, and for just a moment, the years seemed to melt away. She could almost hear the roar of the crowd, feel the burning in her lungs, remember the incredible rush of pushing her body to its absolute limits. That was a lifetime ago. Now she was just Elena Rodriguez, the slightly overweight pay teacher who had to endure the snickers and assumptions of teenagers who thought they knew everything about strength and endurance. She picked up her clipboard and stopwatch, squared her shoulders, and headed back toward the track. Through the window, she could see her students stretching and joking around, clearly not taking the assignment seriously. Jake was flexing for a group of girls, while Brittany was complaining about how the heat would mess up her hair. Mrs. Rodriguez stepped out into the Georgia sunshine, positioning herself at the starting line. The track stretched out before them, a familiar oval of red synthetic material that had seen countless runners over the years. She raised her hand to get the students' attention. When I blow the whistle, you'll begin your mile run, she called. Out. Remember, this is about effort, not speed. Push yourselves, but know your limits. Jake jogged in place, showing off his athletic build. Don't worry, Mrs. Rodriguez. Some of us actually know what we're doing when it comes to fitness. She nodded calmly, raised the whistle to her lips, and gave a sharp blast. The students took off, with the athletes naturally pulling ahead while others settled into more comfortable paces. Mrs. Rodriguez began walking toward the first turn, stopwatch in hand, her eyes tracking each student's form and effort level. What none of them could have imagined was that every step they took, every breath they drew, every bead of sweat that formed on their foreheads was being analyzed by someone who had once run the same distance in under 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Someone who had felt the weight of Olympic medals around her neck and had pushed her body to limits these teenagers couldn't even fathom. But that secret remained locked away, hidden behind the soft exterior of a woman who had learned that sometimes the greatest strength comes from letting others underestimate you. The weeks that followed established a predictable rhythm at Riverside High. Mrs. Rodriguez continued her quiet, methodical approach to teaching, while Jake Patterson and his crew grew increasingly bold with their disrespect. What started as whispered comments had evolved into open mockery, and the teacher's apparent passivity only encouraged them further. During a particularly humid Thursday morning, the class was working on basketball fundamentals in the gymnasium. Mrs. Rodriguez had set up several stations focusing on dribbling, shooting, and defensive positioning. She moved between groups, offering gentle corrections and encouragement to students who were genuinely trying to improve. Sarah, remember to keep your elbow aligned with the basket, she said to a shy sophomore who was struggling with her free throws. Don't worry about making every shot. Focus on consistent form. Sarah nodded gratefully, clearly appreciating the patient's guidance. But from across the court, Jake's voice cut through the instruction like a blade. Maybe if you actually demonstrated proper form, instead of just talking about it, we'd learn something useful," he called out, bouncing a basketball aggressively against the wall. "I mean, when's the last time you actually played basketball, Mrs. Rodriguez?" The gymnasium fell silent except for the rhythmic thud of Jake's ball against the brick wall. Other students stopped their activities. Sensing the tension building in the air, Mrs. Rodriguez straightened slowly, her hands clasped behind her back. "The focus today is on your development, not mine," she replied evenly. "Please continue with the shooting drill." Brittany giggled from her position near the bleachers, where she'd been avoiding participation by claiming her manicured nails prevented her from handling the ball properly. "It's just that some of us actually care about athletics. You know, like Jake's being recruited by Division I schools. Maybe he could teach the class instead." Marcus bounced his basketball with unnecessary force, the sound echoing off the gym walls. "Yeah, I bet Jake could run circles around you, literally." Mrs. Rodriguez walked to the center of the court, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the polished hardwood. She picked up a basketball from the equipment cart, turning it slowly in her hands. For a moment, something shifted in her posture, her shoulders squared, her stance widened slightly, and her grip on the ball became more confident. "Athletics isn't just about current ability," she said quietly. "It's about understanding your body, respecting the process, and recognizing that appearances can be deceiving." She dribbled the ball once, twice, the sound crisp and controlled. Then, without warning, she launched a perfect three-pointer from the center of the court. The ball arced high through the air, spinning with textbook rotation, and swished through the net without touching the rim. The gymnasium erupted in surprised murmurs. Even Jake paused his aggressive dribbling, his eyebrows raised in surprise. Mrs. Rodriguez retrieved another ball and sank 2 more shots in quick succession, each one finding nothing but net. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Lucky shots," Jake muttered, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. Mrs. Rodriguez said nothing, simply returned to her clipboard and continued observing the students. But something had shifted in the room's dynamic. A few students began working harder at their drills, while others cast curious glances at their teacher. The pattern continued over the following days. During a soccer unit, Mrs. Rodriguez casually juggled a ball with her feet while explaining passing techniques, keeping it airborne for nearly 2 minutes without apparent effort. When the class moved to track and field events, she demonstrated proper javelin form with a throw that sailed far beyond the school record markers. Each display of skill was brief and understated, offered as instructional demonstration rather than showboating. But Jake's group wasn't about to let their established hierarchy crumble without a fight. "So she's got some basic skills," Jake announced to his friends during lunch in the cafeteria. "Big deal. I bet she learned all that stuff in some weekend coaching clinic. It doesn't mean she's actually in shape." Brittany picked at her salad, nodding in agreement. "Exactly. Like anyone can make a few lucky shots or kick a ball around. But could she actually compete? I don't think so." Marcus slammed his milk carton down on the table. "I'm sick of everyone acting like she's some kind of athletic genius just because she can do a couple of tricks. If she was really good at sports, she'd be coaching at the college level or something, not teaching pay to high school kids." The conversation was interrupted by Amy Chen, a quiet junior who rarely spoke up in social situations. She'd been sitting at the next table, working on homework, but Jake's increasingly loud complaints had caught her attention. "Maybe you should give her a chance," Amy suggested hesitantly. "She's actually a really good teacher. She helped me improve my mile time by almost 2 minutes." Jake whirled around, his face flushing with irritation. "Nobody asked you." "Amy, And improving your mile time isn't exactly impressive when you started out slower than my grandmother. Amy's cheeks reddened, but she didn't back down. I'm just saying, maybe there's more to Mrs. Rodriguez than you think. She knows things about training and technique that I've never heard from other pay teachers. Like what? Brittany challenged, her voice dripping with skepticism. Well, she taught me about breathing patterns that Olympic runners use, and she showed me how to analyze my stride length to maximize efficiency. She said she learned it from studying elite athletes. Marcus laughed harshly. Studying and doing are two different things. I can watch Olympic swimming on TV, but that doesn't make me Michael Phelps. The exchange typified the growing divide. In the class, while Jake's inner circle remained committed to their dismissive attitude, other students were beginning to notice the depth of Mrs. Rodriguez's knowledge. She could explain the biomechanics of a perfect golf swing, demonstrate the footwork patterns used in professional tennis, and offer insights into training methodologies that seemed far beyond typical pay teacher expertise. But the more respect she gained from some students, the more determined Jake became to undermine her authority. He began arriving to class with a new attitude, treating each session like a personal competition between himself and his teacher. During a volleyball unit, he spiked balls with unnecessary aggression, sending them flying toward Mrs. Rodriguez whenever she wasn't looking. When she calmly retrieved each ball and continued her instruction, he grew more frustrated. "This is boring," he announced during a particularly intense rally. "We're not learning anything new. Maybe we should do something more challenging." Mrs. Rodriguez paused the game, volleyball in hand. "What did you have in mind, Jake?" "I don't know. Something that would actually test our abilities. Like, what if we had a real competition? Students versus teachers. Put your money where your mouth is." The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge. Other students turned to watch Mrs. Rodriguez's response, sensing that this moment would define the remainder of their semester. Mrs. Rodriguez looked at Jake for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she glanced around the gymnasium, taking in the faces of her students. Some looked curious, others nervous, and a few seemed genuinely excited by the prospect. "What kind of competition?" she asked quietly. Jake's grin widened, sensing victory. "Your choice. Pick any sport, any challenge. If you win, we'll stop questioning your methods. If we win, you admit that maybe you're not as qualified as you pretend to be." The gymnasium fell completely silent. Even the usual sounds of squeaking sneakers and bouncing balls seemed to pause in anticipation. Mrs. Rodriguez set down the volleyball and walked to her office. Through the glass window, students could see her reaching for something on her desk, the same framed photograph she'd been looking at for weeks. When she returned, her demeanor had changed completely. Her posture was straighter, her movements more purposeful, and there was a new intensity in her eyes that none of the students had seen before. "All right, Jake," she said, her voice carrying a quiet authority that commanded immediate attention. "You want a real challenge? Let's see what you're really made of." The challenge was set for the following Friday afternoon. Word had spread throughout Riverside High like wildfire, and by the time the final bell rang, nearly half the school had gathered in the gymnasium. Students lined the bleachers, their excited chatter creating a buzz of anticipation that hadn't been felt at the school in years. Mrs. Rodriguez had spent the week in quiet preparation, saying little about Jake's challenge but carrying herself with a new sense of purpose. She'd chosen a triathlon format, swimming, cycling, and running, explaining that it would test overall athletic ability rather than favoring any single skill set. "A triathlon?" Jake had scoffed when she announced the format. "You realize I've been training for football since I was 8, right? I'm in the best shape of my life." "I'm sure you are," Mrs. Rodriguez had replied simply. "The pool is 50 meters. The cycling portion will be 10 laps around the track on stationary. bikes, and we'll finish with a mile run. Does that sound acceptable? Jake had agreed immediately, his confidence unshakable. He'd spent the week telling anyone who would listen that he was going to expose their pay teacher as a fraud once and for all. Now, as the two competitors prepared for the challenge, the atmosphere in the gymnasium was electric. Jake wore his letterman jacket over athletic gear, playing up his role as the school's golden boy. He shadowboxed and stretched dramatically, clearly enjoying the attention from his assembled classmates. Mrs. Rodriguez, meanwhile, had changed into a simple one-piece swimsuit and warm-up clothes that looked like they'd been pulled from the back of a closet. She sat quietly on the bleachers, her eyes closed, breathing deeply and steadily. Principal Williams had agreed to oversee the event, partly out of curiosity and partly to ensure things didn't get out of hand. He stood at the edge of the pool, clipboard in hand, looking somewhat bewildered by the circus atmosphere that had engulfed his typically quiet school. "All right, everyone," he announced, his voice echoing off the tile walls of the pool area. "This is a friendly competition between Mr. Patterson and Mrs. Rodriguez. The format is a 500-meter swim, followed by a stationary bike session, and concluding with a 1-mile run. Are both competitors ready?" Jake cracked his knuckles and grinned at the crowd. "Born ready, Mr. Williams. Let's do this thing." Mrs. Rodriguez simply nodded, removing her warm-up jacket. As she did, several students gasped audibly. Beneath the loose-fitting clothes that had hidden her figure for months was a body that, while not young, was clearly built for endurance. Her shoulders were broader than anyone had noticed. Her legs showed the definition of someone who had spent countless hours training, and her posture at the pool's edge was that of someone completely comfortable in the water. "Swimmers, take your marks," Principal Williams called out. Jake dove in with a splash that sent water cascading over the pool deck. His stroke was powerful but unrefined, relying on brute strength rather than technique. He pulled ahead quickly, his muscular frame cutting through the water with determined force. Mrs. Rodriguez entered the water almost silently, her dive creating barely a ripple. Her stroke was entirely different, efficient, rhythmic, and hypnotic to watch. She moved through the water like it was her natural element, each movement calculated for maximum speed with minimum energy expenditure. By the fourth lap, Jake's breathing had become labored. His stroke rate increased, but his speed began to decrease as fatigue set in. Mrs. Rodriguez, meanwhile, maintained the same steady pace she'd established from the beginning, her breathing pattern never changing. "Come on, Jake," Brittany screamed from the stands. "You've got this." But Jake was struggling. His technique, adequate for short bursts of power, wasn't designed for sustained effort. Water splashed chaotically around him as his form deteriorated, while Mrs. Rodriguez glided past him with movements so smooth they seemed effortless. When Mrs. Rodriguez touched the wall to complete her 500 meters, Jake was still a full lap behind. She pulled herself out of the pool in one fluid motion, water streaming from her hair, and walked calmly to the stationary bikes without showing any signs of exertion. The crowd had gone silent, stunned by what they'd just witnessed. Jake finally reached the wall, gasping for breath, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull himself from the pool. "How is that possible?" Marcus whispered to no one in particular. The cycling portion only widened the gap. Mrs. Rodriguez settled into a cadence that looked sustainable but proved devastatingly effective. Her legs moved with mechanical precision, never wavering from their rhythm. Jake, still recovering from the swim, mounted his bike with determination, but was clearly fighting his own exhaustion. "She's pacing herself," Amy Chun observed quietly to her friend. "Look at her breathing, it's completely controlled." As the laps progressed, Mrs. Rodriguez's superiority became undeniable. She maintained her pace with the focus of someone who had trained for exactly this type of sustained effort. Jake, meanwhile, was pushing harder and harder, his legs burning with lactic acid. his breathing ragged and desperate. When they transitioned to the running portion, Jake was already 2 minutes behind. The gathered students watched in amazement as their soft-looking PE teacher jogged easily toward the outdoor track, while their athletic hero stumbled after her on unsteady legs. The mile run was where Mrs. Rodriguez truly came alive. As soon as her feet hit the track, something transformed in her movement. Her stride lengthened, her breathing found a deeper rhythm, and suddenly she wasn't just running, she was flying. Students who had gathered along the track fence watched in awe as she passed them. Her form was textbook perfect, her pace steady and sustainable, and there was something almost spiritual about watching her move around the oval. "Oh my God," breathed the freshman who had never seen anything like it. "She's incredible." Jake, meanwhile, was struggling to maintain even a jogging pace. His football training had prepared him for short bursts of explosive power, not sustained endurance. By the second lap, he was walking portions of the track, his pride battling against his body's limitations. Mrs. Rodriguez finished her mile in under 6 minutes, crossing the finish line with her arms raised not in celebration, but in pure joy. Her face was flushed with exertion, but she was smiling, really smiling, for the first time since the school year had begun. The assembled students erupted in cheers, but not just for her victory. They were cheering for the revelation of who their teacher truly was. This wasn't just someone who had gotten lucky or pulled off a few tricks. This was an athlete, a real athlete, who had been hiding in plain sight. Jake finished nearly 10 minutes later, supported by Marcus and clearly fighting back tears of frustration and embarrassment. He'd been beaten so thoroughly that arguing seemed pointless. As the crowd began to disperse, buzzing with excitement and disbelief, Mrs. Rodriguez walked quietly back to her office. She sat down at her desk, picked up the framed photograph, and smiled at the image of her younger self. But this time, she didn't put it away. Instead, she placed it prominently on her desk where everyone could see it. Because after hiding for so long, Elena Rodriguez, 3-time Olympic medalist and former world record holder in the 1500 meters, was finally ready to stop pretending to be ordinary. The secret was out, and everything at Riverside High School was about to change. The weekend following the triathlon challenge buzzed with activity as students frantically searched the internet for any information about their mysterious PE teacher. What they discovered left them speechless. Elena Rodriguez hadn't just been an athlete, she'd been a legend. 3 Olympic medals, including gold in the 1500 meters at the 2008 Beijing Olympics, multiple world records, a career that had dominated middle-distance running for nearly a decade before she'd seemingly vanished from the sport. By Monday morning, printouts of newspaper articles, magazine covers, and race results were circulating through Riverside High's hallways. Students gathered in clusters, passing around images of a younger Mrs. Rodriguez, crossing finish lines with her arms raised in triumph, wearing the stars and stripes of Team USA. "Look at this," whispered Jessica Martinez, a sophomore who'd always struggled in PE class. She held up a faded Sports Illustrated cover featuring Mrs. Rodriguez mid-stride, her face a mask of determined focus. She held the world record for 3 years straight. The revelation had hit different students in different ways. Some felt embarrassed about their previous dismissive attitudes, while others were simply amazed that someone of such caliber had been teaching at their small-town school. But perhaps no one was more affected than Jake Patterson himself. Jake had spent the weekend in his room, alternating between anger and shame. The defeat had been humiliating enough, but learning that he'd been mocking an Olympic champion made it infinitely worse. His father, a former college football player who'd always pushed Jake to excel, had been surprisingly quiet about the entire situation. "Son," his father had said during a tense Sunday dinner, "sometimes life teaches us lessons we don't expect. How you handle this will define what kind of man you become." When Jake walked into the gymnasium Monday morning, he found Mrs. Rodriguez setting up equipment for the day's class. The framed photograph now sat prominently on her desk, but she'd also added other mementos, a display case containing her medals, newspaper clippings, and photos from her competitive career. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Jake said quietly, approaching her desk. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like respect. She looked up from her clipboard, her expression neutral but not unkind. "Yes, Jake? I owe you." "An apology," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "I was completely out of line. I had no idea who you were, but that's no excuse for how I acted." Mrs. Rodriguez set down her pen and studied Jake's face. She could see genuine remorse there, mixed with confusion and hurt pride. "Thank you for saying that, Jake, but I want you to understand something. My past achievements don't make me a better teacher than someone without Olympic medals. What matters is whether I can help you improve." Jake shifted uncomfortably. "But why didn't you tell us? I mean, you're famous. You could probably be coaching at any college in the country." Mrs. Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, her fingers absently touching the gold medal in the display case. "Fame is fleeting, Jake, and after I retired from competition, I discovered that what I truly loved wasn't the medals or the records. It was helping people discover what their bodies could do. Every student who improves their mile time or learns proper form or gains confidence in their abilities gives me more satisfaction than any race I ever won. But we treated you like ... double quotes." Jake's voice trailed off. "Like someone who didn't deserve your respect based on appearances," she finished gently. "Yes, you did. And in a way, that taught me something valuable too. It reminded me that respect should be earned through actions, not reputation." As other students began filtering into the gymnasium, the atmosphere was unlike anything the school had experienced. Word of Mrs. Rodriguez's identity had spread far beyond the student body. Parents, who had dismissed her as just another PE teacher, were now calling the school office, asking about her training methods. Local media had caught wind of the story, and reporters were requesting interviews, but Mrs. Rodriguez handled the attention with the same quiet dignity she'd shown in the face of mockery. She declined most interview requests, focusing instead on what she'd come to Riverside High to do: teach. "All right, everyone," she called out as the class assembled. "I know you have questions about my background, and I'm happy to answer them. But first, let's talk about what we're going to do differently moving forward." Amy Chun raised her hand tentatively. "Mrs. Rodriguez, could you teach us some of the training techniques you used when you were competing?" Mrs. Rodriguez smiled, a real smile that transformed her entire face. "Absolutely. But understand that Olympic-level training isn't about pushing yourself to exhaustion. It's about consistency, proper form, and gradually building your capacity. The principles I use to break world records are the same ones that will help you improve your personal bests." Over the next hour, she introduced the class to concepts they'd never encountered in PE before. She explained periodization, how to structure training cycles for optimal improvement. She demonstrated proper running form, breaking down each component of an efficient stride. She taught them about heart rate zones and how to train their body's different energy systems. "The most important thing I learned during my career," she said while demonstrating a dynamic warm-up routine, "is that your body is incredibly adaptable. But it needs consistency and patience. You can't rush the process." Marcus Thompson, who'd been one of Jake's most vocal supporters in mocking their teacher, raised his hand. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I play basketball. Could some of these techniques help me improve my game?" "Absolutely," she replied. "Endurance training will help you maintain your intensity throughout entire games. Proper movement patterns will reduce your injury risk. And understanding how to train your mind, which was a huge part of my success, will help you perform under pressure." The transformation in the class was remarkable. Students who had previously gone through the motions were now asking detailed questions about technique and training. Mrs. Rodriguez had notebooks brought in so they could track their progress, and she began designing individualized programs for each student based on their goals and abilities. Brittany Wells, who had rarely participated in physical activities, approached Mrs. Rodriguez after class. "I've never been athletic," she admitted quietly. "But watching you compete on Friday, I've never seen anything like it. Do you think someone like me could ever run a real race?" Mrs. Rodriguez placed a gentle hand on Brittany's shoulder. "Brittany, I was once told by a coach that I was too short to be a serious middle-distance runner. I was also told that my stride was inefficient and that I'd never make it past the collegiate level. The difference between athletes and non-athletes isn't natural ability. It's the willingness to show up and do the work, even when it's difficult." As the weeks progressed, the changes at Riverside High became increasingly apparent. Students were arriving early to get extra instruction. The track team's times improved dramatically. Even students who weren't naturally athletic began to develop confidence and skills they'd never imagined possible. Mrs. Rodriguez had found her calling in a way she never expected. She wasn't just teaching physical education. She was showing teenagers that their potential was far greater than they'd ever imagined. Just as she had once discovered about herself, the woman who had once run faster than anyone in the world had learned that the greatest victory wasn't crossing a finish line first. It was helping others discover they could cross finish lines they'd never dreamed of reaching. 6 months later, Riverside High School was unrecognizable. What had started as one teacher's quiet determination to make a difference had evolved into a complete cultural transformation that reached far beyond the gymnasium walls. The most dramatic change was in the students themselves. Jake Patterson, once the epitome of arrogant athleticism, had become Mrs. Rodriguez's most dedicated student. Under her guidance, he'd learned to channel his natural competitiveness into disciplined training. His football performance had improved so dramatically that college scouts were taking notice, not just of his physical abilities, but of his newfound mental toughness and leadership qualities. "Before Mrs. Rodriguez, I thought being strong meant dominating other people," Jake explained to a local newspaper reporter who was writing a feature about the school's transformation. "She taught me that real strength comes from pushing yourself beyond what you think is possible and helping others do the same." Jake's transformation had a ripple effect throughout the school's social hierarchy. When the star quarterback publicly credited his success to lessons learned from someone he'd initially mocked, it sent a powerful message about the value of humility and open-mindedness. Brittany Wells had perhaps undergone the most surprising metamorphosis. The former cheerleader who had complained about messing up her hair had discovered a passion for distance running that shocked everyone, including herself. She'd started with the goal of simply completing a 5K race, but under Mrs. Rodriguez's patient guidance, she'd progressed to training for her first half marathon. "I never understood what athletes meant when they talked about pushing through barriers," Brittany told her friends during lunch, her face glowing with the satisfaction of someone who had found their calling. "But when Mrs. Rodriguez taught me about mental strength and proper pacing, everything clicked. Running became this meditation where I could prove to myself that I'm capable of more than I ever imagined." The ripple effects extended far beyond individual students. The school's track and field team, which had been mediocre for years, was now dominating regional competitions. But more importantly, participation in athletics across all sports had increased by over 200%. Students who had never considered themselves athletic were joining teams, not because they expected to become stars, but because Mrs. Rodriguez had shown them that improvement and personal growth were rewards in themselves. Marcus Thompson had taken his basketball game to an entirely new level by incorporating endurance training and mental preparation techniques that Mrs. Rodriguez had shared from her Olympic experience. His vertical leap had increased by 6 inches, but more significantly, his ability to maintain peak performance throughout entire games had made him a standout player being recruited by Division I programs. She didn't just teach us about physical training, Marcus explained to his teammates. She taught us how to train our minds, how to stay focused under pressure, how to visualize success, how to bounce back from setbacks. That mental game is what separates good athletes from great ones. The transformation wasn't limited to the athletic students. Amy Chun, the quiet junior who had defended Mrs. Rodriguez during the cafeteria confrontation, had discovered a talent for coaching younger students. Mrs. Rodriguez had recognized Amy's natural ability to break down complex movements and explain them clearly, and had encouraged her to work with the middle school athletics program. Mrs. Rodriguez saw something in me that I never saw in myself. Amy reflected while helping a group of 7th graders with their running form. She taught me that leadership isn't about being the loudest or most confident person in the room. Sometimes it's about being the person who notices when someone else needs encouragement or guidance. The changes extended beyond the student body to the faculty and community. Other teachers began incorporating some of Mrs. Rodriguez's motivational techniques into their own classrooms. Her emphasis on process over results, on celebrating small improvements rather than just final achievements, had created a more positive learning environment throughout the school. Principal Williams found himself fielding calls from other schools, wanting to understand how Riverside High had achieved such dramatic improvements in student engagement and athletic performance. Educational consultants were requesting meetings to study their methods. The secret isn't complicated, Principal Williams explained during a district meeting. We have someone who understands that teaching isn't about demonstrating your own abilities. It's about unlocking potential in others. Mrs. Rodriguez could have leveraged her Olympic background for personal recognition, but instead she used it as a tool to inspire students to exceed their own expectations. The local community had also taken notice. Parents who had initially been skeptical of the new pay teacher were now volunteering to help with expanded athletic programs. Local businesses had begun sponsoring equipment and travel expenses for the school's increasingly successful teams. Mrs. Rodriguez herself seemed genuinely surprised by the magnitude of change her presence had created. She still drove the same modest car, lived in the same small apartment, and maintained the same humble demeanor that had initially led students to underestimate her. But there was a new energy in her step, a satisfaction that came from knowing she had found her true calling. When I was competing, success was measured in seconds and rankings, she explained to a group of visiting educators who had come to observe her methods. But teaching has shown me that the most meaningful victories can't be measured by stopwatches or scoreboards. When I see a student discover they can do something they never believed possible, that's worth more than any medal I ever won. The story of Mrs. Rodriguez and her transformation of Riverside High School had begun to attract attention beyond the local community. Sports magazines were writing features about the Olympic champion who had chosen teaching over lucrative coaching positions. Educational journals were analyzing her methods and their remarkable results, but perhaps the most telling measure of her impact came during the school's annual awards ceremony in May, when Principal Williams announced that Mrs. Rodriguez had been selected as Teacher of the Year. The standing ovation from students, parents, and faculty lasted for nearly 5 minutes. Jake Patterson, now serving as student body president, had requested the honor of presenting the award. As he handed her the plaque, he spoke words that captured what many in the audience were feeling. Mrs. Rodriguez taught us that champions aren't defined by their trophies or their records, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the packed auditorium. Champions are defined by their ability to help others become champions too. She showed us that the greatest victory isn't proving you're better than someone else. It's proving to yourself that you're better than you used to be. As Mrs. Rodriguez accepted the award, she looked out at the faces in the audience, students who had discovered hidden talents, parents who had watched their children bloom with new confidence, and colleagues who had been inspired to elevate their own teaching. She thought about the journey that had brought her from Olympic podiums to a small-town high school gymnasium, and realized that this moment represented the greatest achievement of her career. The woman who had once been the fastest in the world had learned that the most important race wasn't about reaching the finish line first. It was about ensuring that everyone who ran with you discovered they were capable of finishing it all. In the end, Elena Rodriguez had found something more valuable than gold medals. She had found a way to multiply her own success by the number of lives she could touch. And at Riverside High School, that number was growing every day. 2 years after the triathlon challenge that changed everything, Riverside High School received an unexpected visitor, Dr. Michael Stevens, head coach of the U.S. at track and field. Olympic Development Program, had driven 4 hours from Atlanta specifically to meet with Mrs. Rodriguez. The meeting took place in Principal Williams' office on a crisp October morning. Dr. Stevens, a tall man with graying temples and the focused intensity of someone accustomed to working with elite athletes, sat across from Mrs. Rodriguez with a folder full of documents. "Elena, I'll get straight to the point," he said, using her first name, with the familiarity of someone who had known her during her competitive years. "We've been tracking what you've accomplished here at Riverside. The performance improvements, the methodology, the culture change, it's unprecedented." Mrs. Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She'd been dreading this conversation ever since news of her teaching success had reached the national athletics community. "Michael, I appreciate you coming here, but if this is about returning to competitive coaching, it's bigger than that," Dr. Stevens interrupted, opening his folder. "We want you to head our new National Youth Development Initiative. It's a program designed to identify and nurture young talent at the high school level, but more importantly, to revolutionize how we approach athletics education in America." He spread several documents across the desk, organizational charts, budget projections, and program outlines that represented millions of dollars in federal funding. "You'd be based in Colorado Springs, working directly with Olympic Training Center facilities. Your salary would be triple what you're making here, plus benefits that would set you up for life." Principal Williams, who had been listening quietly, felt his heart sink. He'd known this day would come eventually. Someone of Mrs. Rodriguez's caliber was too valuable to remain in a small Georgia town forever. Mrs. Rodriguez studied the documents carefully, her expression unreadable. The offer was everything she could have dreamed of during her competitive career: prestige, resources, the opportunity to work with the most promising young athletes in the country. "The position comes with complete autonomy," Dr. Stevens continued. "You'd design the curriculum, select your staff, and determine the training philosophies. Essentially, you'd have the chance to reshape how America develops its future Olympic athletes." "And what about my students here?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked quietly. Dr. Stevens looked puzzled by the question. "Elena, you'd be working with students, the most talented young athletes in the nation. Kids who actually have the potential to compete at the highest levels." The phrase hung in the air like a challenge. Mrs. Rodriguez set down the document and looked directly at Dr. Stevens. "Michael, every single one of my students has potential. Maybe not Olympic potential in the traditional sense, but potential to become better than they ever imagined possible." "Of course," Dr. Stevens said dismissively, "but we're talking about real talent here. Athletes who could represent their country, who could inspire millions of people." Mrs. Rodriguez stood up and walked to the window overlooking the school's athletic fields. Outside, she could see her current PE class working through an obstacle course she'd designed. Jake Patterson was helping a struggling freshman navigate a particularly difficult section, while Brittany Wells encouraged a group of girls who were attempting their first rope climbs. "Let me tell you about real inspiration, Michael," she said without turning around. "Sarah Kim couldn't run a quarter mile without stopping when she started my class. Last month, she completed her first 1OK race. Tommy Valdez was so overweight, that other kids made fun of him in the locker room. He's now the strongest kid in his grade and has become a mentor to other students struggling with confidence. She turned back to face Dr. Stevens, her voice gaining strength. Jessica Barnes was in a car accident that left her with a permanent limp. Doctors told her she'd never be athletic again. She just set a school record in shot put using a technique we developed specifically for her physical limitations. Dr. Stevens frowned, clearly not understanding her point. Those are nice stories, Elena, but we're talking about developing Olympians here. These kids will never compete at that level. You're right, Mrs. Rodriguez said firmly. They'll never win Olympic medals. But they're learning lessons that will serve them for the rest of their lives. They're discovering that limitations can be overcome, that consistent effort produces results, that failure is just feedback for improvement. She picked up one of the photographs from her desk, a group shot of her current students celebrating after a school-wide fitness challenge. These kids will become parents, teachers, coaches, business leaders. They'll carry forward the idea that everyone deserves the chance to discover their potential. That's a legacy that reaches far beyond any medal count. Dr. Stevens closed his folder, clearly frustrated. Elena, you're one of the greatest middle-distance runners in history. Don't you want to work with athletes who could follow in your footsteps? Mrs. Rodriguez smiled, but there was steel behind it. I am working with athletes who could follow in my footsteps. Not the footsteps of my racing career, but the footsteps of who I've become since then. Someone who believes that the greatest victory is helping others achieve things they never thought possible. The meeting ended with Dr. Stevens leaving his contact information, saying the offer would remain open indefinitely. But Mrs. Rodriguez had already made her decision before he'd finished his presentation. That afternoon, word of the Olympic programs offer spread through the school with the same speed that news of her athletic background had traveled 2 years earlier. Students began approaching her with worried expressions, afraid that their beloved teacher might be leaving. Mrs. Rodriguez. Amy Chun asked nervously after class, "Are you going to take that job in Colorado?" Mrs. Rodriguez gathered her students in a circle on the gymnasium floor, something she did whenever important conversations needed to happen. "I want you all to understand something," she began. 2 years ago, I thought my greatest accomplishments were behind me. I thought the most important races I'd ever run were already finished. She looked around the circle at faces that had become so familiar, so dear to her. But I was wrong. The most important races aren't the ones where you compete against other people. They're the ones where you compete against your own limitations. And those races happen every single day right here in this gymnasium. Jake Patterson, now senior and headed to college on a football scholarship, raised his hand. "So you're staying?" "I'm staying," Mrs. Rodriguez confirmed, and the cheer that erupted from her students could be heard throughout the school. Later that evening, as she packed up her office, Mrs. Rodriguez reflected on the decision that had seemed so difficult but ultimately proved so easy. She looked at her Olympic medals, still displayed proudly on her desk, and realized they represented just one chapter of her story. The real story was still being written, one student at a time. One breakthrough at a time, one moment of discovered potential at a time. And that story was far from over. Outside her window, the track where she'd first revealed her true abilities to Jake Patterson's challenge stood empty in the fading light. Tomorrow, it would once again be filled with students pushing themselves toward goals they'd never imagined reaching. And Elena Rodriguez, 3-time Olympic medalist and world record holder, would be there to guide them every step of the way. 5 years had passed since Elena Rodriguez first walked into Riverside High School's gymnasium as an underestimated pay teacher. The woman who had once held world records was now creating a different kind of legacy, one measured not in seconds shaved off race times, but in lives transformed and potential unlocked. The school district had officially renamed the athletic complex the Rodriguez Center for Athletic Excellence. But Alina had insisted on a subtitle that better reflected her philosophy, where every student discovers their strength. The dedication ceremony had drawn visitors from across the state, including several of her former Olympic teammates who came to understand why she'd chosen teaching over lucrative coaching positions. On this particular spring morning, Alina stood at the edge of the track watching her latest group of students prepare for their final fitness assessments of the semester. The scene had become beautifully familiar yet endlessly rewarding. Teenagers of all athletic abilities, pushing themselves toward personal goals that had seemed impossible just months earlier. Mrs. Rodriguez called out David Chen, Amy's younger brother, who had inherited both her quiet determination and her natural teaching instincts. "I think I'm ready to try for that sub-7-minute mile we've been working toward." Alina smiled, checking her stopwatch. David had started the year unable to run a full lap without walking, but consistent training and unwavering belief in his capabilities had transformed him into a confident athlete. More importantly, his success had inspired 3 other students who'd thought they were too slow to even attempt mile-time trials. "Remember what we practiced," Alina told him as he took his position at the starting line. "Pace yourself for the first 3 laps, then trust. You're training for that final kick. Your body knows what to do." As David began his run, Alina's attention was drawn to a commotion near the gymnasium entrance. A sleek black SUV had pulled up, and she recognized the figure emerging from it immediately. It was Jake Patterson, now 23 and starring as a linebacker for the Atlanta Falcons. But he wasn't alone. Behind him stepped a teenage girl, perhaps 16, who bore a striking resemblance to Jake's confident posture, but with an edge of nervous uncertainty. Jake's younger sister, Alina realized, though she'd heard the family had been through some difficult times since Jake's rise to NFL stardom. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Jake called out, jogging toward her with the easy athleticism that had made him a professional. "Success. I hope you don't mind us dropping by unannounced." Alina embraced her former student warmly. Jake's transformation from arrogant teenager to thoughtful young man had been one of her proudest achievements, and their occasional communications had kept her updated on his professional and personal growth. "Jake, what a wonderful surprise," she said, then turned to the girl beside him. "And you must be Megan. I've heard so much about you." Megan Patterson shifted uncomfortably, her eyes taking in the track where students were engaged in various training activities. Unlike her brother's natural confidence, she seemed to carry herself with the defensive posture of someone who'd been hurt and disappointed before. "Megan's been having some trouble at her school in Atlanta," Jake explained carefully. "She's incredibly smart and talented, but she's been hanging around with the wrong crowd, getting into fights, skipping classes. My parents are worried she's heading down a dangerous path." Alina studied the girl's face, recognizing something familiar in her expression. The same mixture of pain and defiance she'd seen in many students over the years. "What brings you here, Megan?" "Jake thinks you can fix me," Megan said with teenage sarcasm. "He keeps talking about how you changed his life or whatever. But I'm not him, and I don't need fixing." Alina nodded thoughtfully. "You're absolutely right. You don't need fixing because you're not broken. But sometimes we all need help discovering what we're really capable of." On the track, David Chun was entering his final lap, his form still strong despite the obvious effort. A small crowd of students had gathered to cheer him on, their enthusiasm genuine and supportive. Alina watched Megan's reaction to the scene. Beneath the defensive attitude, there was curiosity and perhaps a hint of longing. "Tell me about yourself, Megan," Alina said as they walked toward the bleachers. "What do you enjoy? What makes you feel alive?" Megan shrugged. "Nothing really. School's boring, my friends are jerks, and everyone expects me to be perfect like Jake. I'm tired of disappointing people." Alina sat down on the bleachers, patting the space beside her. "Do you know what I see when I look at you? A screw-up?" Megan asked bitterly. I see someone who's been told so many times what she should be that she's forgotten who she actually is, Elena replied. I see intelligence in your eyes, strength in your posture, and pain that you're carrying like armor. Because you think it protects you. David Chun crossed the finish line with a time of 6:58, and the celebration from his classmates was immediate and heartfelt. Elena pointed to the scene. See that boy? When he started my class, he thought he was worthless at athletics. Now he's discovered something about himself that no one can ever take away. But I'm not athletic, Megan protested. I hate running and sports and all that stuff, Elena smiled. Athletics isn't about sports, Megan. It's about setting a goal that scares you, working consistently toward it, and discovering that you're stronger than you believed. The physical activity is just the vehicle. Over the next hour, Elena introduced Megan to various students and activities around the athletic complex. She met Sarah Kim, now a senior, who was training other students in distance running techniques. She watched Brittany Wells, who had returned as a volunteer coach, leading a group of middle schoolers through proper stretching routines. Everyone here seems so happy, Megan observed reluctantly. They've learned something that took me years to understand, Elena explained. Happiness isn't about being perfect or meeting other people's expectations. It's about becoming the best version of yourself, whatever that looks like. As the day progressed, something subtle began to shift in Megan's demeanor. When Elena asked if she'd like to try a simple obstacle course designed for beginners, Megan surprised everyone by agreeing. Her natural athleticism, inherited from Jake's genetic line, was immediately apparent. But more importantly, Elena saw her begin to smile for the first time. I don't know why, Megan said after completing the course, but that actually felt good. Elena nodded knowingly. Because for the first time in a while, you challenged yourself instead of letting circumstances challenge you. There's a big difference. By the time Jake was ready to leave, Megan had agreed to spend 2 weeks at Riverside High as part of a student exchange program. Elena had quietly arranged with the principal. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it was a beginning. Thank you, Jake said quietly to Elena as they prepared to leave. I know you can't save everyone, but maybe you can help her remember who she used to be before life got so complicated. I'm not here to save anyone, Jake, Elena replied. I'm here to remind people that they have the power to save themselves. The rest is up to them. As the SUV disappeared down the road, Elena returned to her students who were finishing their training sessions. The sun was setting over Riverside High School, casting long shadows across the track where so many personal victories had been achieved. Elena Rodriguez had never won another race after retiring from competition. She'd never set another world record or stood on another Olympic podium. But as she watched her students pack up their equipment, laughing and encouraging each other, she knew she'd found something more valuable than any medal. She'd found a way to multiply her own strength by the number of lives she could touch. And in the small town of Riverside, Georgia, that number grew a little bit every single day. The woman who had once been the fastest in the world had learned that the most important race was the one where everyone crossed the finish line stronger than when they started. And that race would continue long after she was gone, carried forward by every student who had discovered they were capable of more than they ever imagined. 3 months later, Megan Patterson had officially transferred to Riverside High School. The transformation wasn't instant or magical. Real change never is. But under Elena's patient guidance and the supportive environment of the school, Megan began to rediscover pieces of herself that had been buried under years of anger and disappointment. I want to start a mentorship program, Megan announced during one of their regular after-school conversations. Like, pair older students with younger ones who are struggling. Not just with athletics, but with life stuff. Elena looked up from the training schedule she was reviewing, impressed but not surprised by Megan's suggestion. The girl had inherited not just Jake's physical gifts, but also his natural leadership abilities. She just needed the right environment to let them flourish. "That's an excellent idea," Elena said. "What made you think of it?" Megan shifted in her chair, still uncomfortable with direct praise, but learning to accept it. "I keep thinking about how different things might have been if I'd had someone like you when my parents started fighting all the time. Maybe I wouldn't have made so many stupid choices." The honesty in Megan's voice reminded Elena why she loved working with teenagers. Beneath all their bravado and defensiveness lay incredible wisdom and compassion, waiting for the right moment to emerge. "So what would this program look like?" Elena asked, setting aside her paperwork to give Megan her full attention. Over the next hour, Megan outlined a comprehensive plan that would pair upperclassmen with underclassmen, based not on academic performance or athletic ability, but on shared challenges and experiences. Students who had overcome eating disorders would work with those currently struggling. Former bullies who had learned empathy would mentor kids dealing with anger issues. Athletes would be paired with non-athletes to break down the social barriers that often divided high school communities. "The beauty of your idea," Elena said when Megan finished explaining, "is that it recognizes something I learned during my Olympic career. Everyone has something valuable to teach, regardless of their current skill level." Within 6 weeks, the Riverside Reach Mentorship Program had launched with 40 student pairs. The results were immediate and profound. Academic performance improved across all grade levels, disciplinary incidents decreased by 60%, and the overall school climate became noticeably more supportive and inclusive. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the mentors themselves. Students who had previously defined themselves by their problems began to see themselves as solutions. Megan, who had been appointed student coordinator of the program, discovered leadership abilities she never knew she possessed. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Megan said during one of their weekly check-ins, "I think I want to become a teacher. Like, actually help kids the way you've helped me and Jake and everyone else here." Elena felt a familiar surge of pride mixed with humility. Watching students discover their calling was one of the greatest privileges of her profession. "What kind of teaching interests you?" "I don't know yet," Megan admitted. "Maybe counseling or social work or even pay like you. I just know I want to help kids who feel as lost as I did." Word of the mentorship program's success spread throughout the educational community. Delegations from other school districts began visiting Riverside High to observe the program in action. Educational researchers requested permission to study the model for potential replication. The Georgia Department of Education invited Elena to present at their annual conference, but the attention that meant the most to Elena came from an unexpected source: Dr. Michael Stevens, the Olympic Development Program Director who had tried to recruit her years earlier, requested another meeting. This time, however, he came not with job offers, but with questions about methodology. "Elena," he said as they sat in the same conference room where she'd rejected his previous offer, "I owe you an apology. When we spoke before, I thought you were wasting your talents on students who would never compete at elite levels." Elena listened patiently, curious about what had changed his perspective. "But I've been watching what you've accomplished here," Dr. Stevens continued, "and I'm beginning to understand something I missed before. The principles that create Olympic champions: mental toughness, consistent effort, goal setting, overcoming setbacks. Those same principles can transform anyone's life." He pulled out a tablet and showed Elena a presentation he'd been developing. "We want to create a nationwide program based on your model, not to identify Olympic talent, but to use athletic principles to help all students develop life skills. We're calling it Champions for Life." Elena studied the presentation slides, seeing her philosophy and methods translated into a broader educational framework. The program would train pay teachers across the country to use athletic principles for character development, not just physical fitness. "We want you to head the program," Dr. Stevens said. "You'd travel to schools nationwide, training teachers, developing curriculum, and spreading this approach to millions of students. You'd still be teaching, just on a much larger scale." Elena considered the offer carefully. The program represented everything she believed about the transformative power of athletics education. It would allow her to multiply her impact exponentially, reaching students she could never touch personally. "I need time to think about it," she said finally. That evening, Elena found herself walking the track where her journey at Riverside High had truly begun, the place where she'd first revealed her Olympic background to Jake Patterson's challenge. The facility was empty except for the distant sounds of a baseball game on the adjacent field. As she completed her first lap, Elena reflected on the path that had brought her here. Her Olympic career had been about personal excellence, pushing her own limits to achieve individual glory. Her teaching career had been about communal excellence, helping others discover capabilities they didn't know they possessed. Now she faced a choice between depth and breadth, continuing to impact students deeply at Riverside High or spreading her influence more widely but less personally across the nation. By her third lap, the answer had become clear. Elena pulled out her phone and called Dr. Stevens. "Michael," she said when he answered, "I'll take the position, but with one condition." "What's that?" "I want to maintain a teaching position at Riverside High for at least half of each year. This school and these students are where I learned how to be an educator. I won't abandon them for any program, no matter how worthy." Dr. Stevens agreed immediately, recognizing that Elena's connection to Riverside High was precisely what gave her work its authenticity and power. 6 months later, Elena Rodriguez found herself standing before an auditorium filled with 500 PE teachers from across the United States. The same woman who had once been too nervous to speak up in faculty meetings was now preparing to address educators who would potentially impact millions of students. "When I retired from competitive running," she began, "I thought my racing days were over, but I was wrong. Every day in our gymnasiums and on our athletic fields, we have the opportunity to help students run the most important race of their lives, the race to become their best selves." The presentation that followed combined her Olympic experience with her Riverside High discoveries, showing how athletic principles could develop character, resilience, and confidence in students regardless of their natural abilities. In the audience, teachers scribbled notes furiously, recognizing the transformative potential of what Elena was describing. Many approached her afterward with stories of students who needed exactly this type of holistic approach to physical education. "You've given us permission to be more than just pay teachers," one educator from Oregon told her. "You've shown us how to be life coaches." As Elena traveled from school to school over the following months, implementing the Champions for Life program, she carried with her the lessons learned at Riverside High. Each new group of students she encountered reminded her that potential exists everywhere, waiting for the right person to recognize and nurture it. The program's impact was measurable and profound. Schools reported significant improvements in academic performance, student behavior, and overall school climate. But more importantly, thousands of students were discovering that they were capable of far more than they had ever imagined. One implementation visit to a school in Detroit, Elena met Marcus Williams, a 15-year-old who reminded her strongly of Jake Patterson in his early arrogance and athleticism. Like Jake, Marcus dominated his peers physically, but used his advantages to intimidate rather than inspire. "I heard you used to be famous or something," Marcus said dismissively during Elena's first day at his school. "But that was a long time ago. What can you teach us that we don't already know?" Elena smiled, recognizing the familiar challenge. "That's an excellent question, Marcus. What do you think makes someone truly strong?" The conversation that followed and the transformation that began that day reminded Elena why her work mattered. Marcus, like Jake before him, discovered that real strength came not from dominating others, but from lifting them up. By the program's second year, Champions for Life had been implemented in over 200 schools across 15 states. Elena's methodology was being studied by educational researchers, and her approach was influencing physical education curriculum development at the national level. But through it all, Riverside High School remained her home base and her inspiration. Every semester, she returned to teach her regular classes, work with new students, and remember why she had chosen education over elite coaching. Standing in her familiar gymnasium on a quiet Friday afternoon, watching Megan Patterson lead a group of 7th graders through team-building exercises, Elena reflected on the unexpected turns her life had taken. She had gone from being one of the fastest humans alive to becoming someone who helped others discover their own speed, not just physical, but emotional, intellectual, and spiritual. The woman who had once measured success in hundreds of seconds now measured it in transformed lives. And by that metric, Elena Rodriguez had achieved something that no Olympic record could represent. She had learned to create champions not just of athletics, but of life itself. In the end, Elena Rodriguez had achieved something that no stopwatch could measure and no record book could contain. She had proven that the greatest champions are those who create other champions. At Riverside High School and in gymnasiums across America, that legacy would endure forever. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.